Good afternoon and evening, everyone, and welcome to Stamp Talks presented by the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada. Tonight, we are graced by the presence of David K. Foote, who is a member of the Royal and Philatelic Specialist Society of Canada, as well as other clubs and specialist societies. He served on Canada Post Stamp Advisory Committee for 2 terms from 2012 to 2018. And his collecting interests focus primarily on the British Pacific region, especially Australasia. He has given a number of previous stamp talks, including on Campbell Island, the European Rocket Program in Australia, and I think probably the most viewed was the Eclipse Philately. The most recent presentation was Mutiny on the Bounty, which drew on his Pitcairn and Norfolk Island collections. And tonight, hold on to your hats, folks, he introduces us to the British atomic bomb tests in Australia, covering the period from 1952 to 1967, and I think it promises to be very fascinating. All right, before we go further, I invite Alan to give our land acknowledgement for the night.
Thanks, Lisa. I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting virtually today on many traditional, unceded, and treaty territories across this land. Personally, I'm joining you from the region of Waterloo, which is situated on lands within the Haldimand Treaty of 1784, a formally ratified agreement acknowledging 6 miles on either side of the Grand River as treaty territory belonging to the 6 nations of the Grand River. The region of Waterloo serves an area within the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Chonatan, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Because we are gathered digitally from coast to coast to coast, I encourage everyone to take a moment to reflect on the specific Indigenous lands where you are today. We offer our respect to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial, and we reaffirm our commitment to the ongoing journey of reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. All right, David, take it away. I just saw Duncan's comment that it should be a blast.
Are we good to go?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lisa and Alan, and thank you to everyone else who's joining us this afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be. This Maralinga stands for Fields of Thunder in the local Aboriginal tongue in Australia, and it's certainly appropriate for atom bomb tests. This presentation is about Australia, but it could well have been about Canada. Back in 1943, the Americans and the British agreed to share information on nuclear technology and signed an agreement, and the Brits joined the Manhattan Project. But then in 1946 or thereabouts, an act of American in America interrupted that relationship and precluded further sharing of atomic technology. And the Brits found they had to go it alone. And so the Brits were looking for a big, wide open space, uninhabited preferably, with access to ports or whatever, for their testing. And Canada, of course, came to mind. And they approached, in 1950, they approached the Louis Saint Laurent government here in Canada for permission to use Churchill, Manitoba as the site for their tests. They were turned down, and as a result, they ended up doing the atom bomb tests in Australia. And so this could be a Canadian story, but it's turning out to be an Australian story. Now, let me quickly run through what I'd like to do this evening. First of all, an introduction on Australia and where the test took place. Then I'll cover the different tests sequences and do the postal matters. Now, this is a little before I get to conclusions. To dig a little deeper, there are a number of tests. They were called operations: Hurricane, Totem, Mosaic, Buffalo, Antler, to cover. And so covering the history first. before going into postal matters, that's been my decision. That means that you're going to see a lot of covers from Australia to Great Britain, normal covers, nothing particularly distinguishing. But what's going to be distinguishing are the cancellations, perhaps the cachets, since I've chosen ones with some rather nice cachets, but also what's on the back of the cover, who sent the cover, and why. So it tells you that you need to have a really good look at your covers to help understand the full significance of them. Then I'll dig into the postal matters, the concession rates, the British Forces post offices, and the field post offices, and a couple of other items there. Moving on, the big picture, there were 12 atmospheric atom bomb tests on Australian territory at 3 locations over 1952 to 1957. An additional 9 took place subsequently in, not in Christmas Island in the Pacific, but they weren't on Australian territory. But the real damage was done by the additional experimental tests at Maralinga, where they were testing all sorts of components of an atom bomb. And that left quite a lot of contamination. All the Australian tests relate to the development of the atom bomb, not the hydrogen bomb. In fact, the agreement with Australia precluded the use of hydrogen bombs. So the 12 atmospheric bomb tests are going to be our first. This is the test schedule. 1952, Operation Hurricane at the Montebello Islands. There was 1 test there. 1953, they went into Australian desert to Woomera Emu Field. 2 tests were there. 1956, they went back to the Montebello Islands for 2 additional tests. And then 56 and 57, they went to Maralinga, which is what we put on the title of this test. The minor tests were pretty much all done at Maralinga. Not all, but almost all. So where are these 3 locations that were chosen? Well, you can see on the map of Australia, Maralinga is down in South Australia, SA, South Australia. Emu Field is a little north of Maralinga. But the Montebello Islands are way out here in Western Australia with WA. So what's the connection between Emu Field and Maralinga, and why were these chosen? Well, first of all, they're all surrounded by desert. There really isn't very much going on there. No major cities. In fact, almost uninhabited, although our Aboriginal friends would not agree with that statement. But secondly, there was a connection because the Woomera rocket range had been established in 1947 to test long-range weapon systems after World War II. So there was already an established rocket range here in Woomera, in this area. And the rockets were fired in a northwesterly direction, up in this direction. And you can see there is sort of a cone of use of that rocket range. And that's why a spot here in Western Australia and a spot here in the desert would be good places to test atom bombs, because they were already restricted areas. You can see from the picture at the bottom what the landscape looks like in this part of the world, and it certainly is pretty forbidding. As I said, surrounded by deserts. Perth is the capital of Western Australia. That'll feature in a moment. And Adelaide, the capital of South Australia. And they were 2 very important locations for sounding the bombs. So that's where the testing took place. Pushing a little bit further, you can see the Woomera rocket range on the right here was already well established. And then what they did is they bolted Maralinga, the Maralinga range, next to the Woomera range for a complete feeling. This is the blown up map, and that's Maralinga village. This is Woomera over here, and this dotted line here is the Cross Australia Railway line. So the railway line was built in 1917, but that meant they could get heavy duty rockets and a whole lot of things delivered to a siding called Watson here, and then moved up to build Maralinga village and further up to do a lot of the tests in this area. Yalata Mission is just worth pointing out because there was one person assigned to try and go out and talk to the Aborigines, and he tried to convince them, the ones that he came across, to all come down to Yalata Mission, and that way they wouldn't be in any danger whatsoever. Moving on, needless to say, he wasn't terribly successful because they are nomadic people and therefore they're on the move a lot of the time. And many of them have never, particularly in this area, in the Great Victoria Desert area, had never come in contact with a white man. This was back in the 1950s, of course. So there's the background to the location of the tests. Now the tests. Moving on. First test was in the Northwest Territory of Australia, up here in Montebello Islands, the Royal Australian Navy. And by the way, all three military, Army, Navy, Air Force were involved in all of this. And it was not only a tri-level effort, but it was also the Army, Navy, and Air Force from both Britain and Australia. So you're dealing with 6 institutions, and they all had to be combined. Different ones took the lead on different things, and needless to say, since this was off in the islands, off the northwest part of Australia, the Navy took the Royal Navy and took the lead on this one. They put the atomic device, in the hull of the frigate Plym, which was scheduled for decommissioning anyway, and harbored it right here in the islands. Everyone then observed it from this island here. So here's a cover before the test. The test took place in October 1952. So here's a cover in June 52, going to the lead command ship, the Campania ship in foreign waters, and this is when it would have been preparing to go out to the Montebello Islands for the test. So that's an inwards to the ship, and here is an outwards from the ship, again September 1952, still before the test in October 52. Sent presumably it would have been registered. It's registered, and presumably it would have contained film for processing because it was mailed to the Kodak company in Perth. Perth being the capital of West Australia, the port being Fremantle, and the Royal Australian Air Force Base Pearce being the foundation for the Air Force involvement in the Montebello Islands test. Before the test in 1952, these little local post items appeared from dealer in England, and the argument was that they were going to take mail and deposit it at Onslow, and then it would be flown down to Perth. So they were a local post that was designed to take the mail of the servicemen and put it on into the regular mail stream. However, no one has ever seen a cover with these 3 local post items on it. They're not rare, but they're hard to find, particularly the sixpenny one at the right. And so they're now considered nothing but local post bogus items. But I love Cinderellas, and any way I can get a Cinderella into an exhibit or into a talk, I love doing it. So these weren't, look, they're bogus. So the test took place in October 52, which is the spring in Australia. Was a success. The ship blew up a big hole in the under the water, but about 12 meters deep, and the test was considered a success. But they needed to move on, and the Brits, and they wanted to test additional components and additional ideas, but it took 18 months for the Navy to establish, and they wanted to move before that, so they wanted to go in 53. So they decided to move to the Australian mainland and go to Emu Field. And remember, I pointed out that Emu Field was, within 250 miles of Woomera. Let me also take a moment to step out here and remind everyone that Australia is the same size as continental US. So it's 4,000 kilometers across. And we're talking about big distances for these people to have to make roads and airstrips and all the rest of it. This was not easy work. And it was also very secretive work. So let me just read the top secret document here. And let me just read it, signed by William Penny, W.G. Penny, and he was the father of the British bomb. He was the head of the British delegation to the Manhattan Project in the US, and then led the development of Britain's atomic bombs. As a mathematical nuclear physicist, he studied the damaging effects of blast waves. He supervised the operation of the totem test in 1953 and approved the selection of the Maralinga test site, which we'll talk about in a minute. So here is a cover on active service going back to England. HMA ships, be a naval cover. It was pass-free initially, but then it was deemed that the Royal Navy personnel and therefore entitled to a concession rate. And it turns out the concession rate, and we'll see more of this a little later on, from Australia back to England was threepence. And so this is a cover from the period that the totem tests, although I can't prove that the Navy was certainly involved, even though the Army was mainly doing a lot of the preparation for the totem test in the desert. But this is a cover that the Navy might have also been involved there. So that was 1953. Well, in 1954, the British really wanted a secure site. The problem with Emu Field is they had a lot of dust storms, and the water, there was almost no water. The only water you could get was drilling down into a bore in the desert, and they got water that way, but it was very problematic. So they requested in 1954 a permanent site in Australia, and they, as I suggest here, had surveyed the Maralinga site and decided that that would be a good site. But before then, they went back to the Montebello Islands in 1956. And this was called Operation Mosaic. And there were two tests, G1, G2. This is where the first test took place, and these are the second test. This was a fairly small one, but this was a massive test. These were on towers. The atomic device was located on 100-foot high towers, and the explosion, both of these were observed from other islands in this Montebello group. This cover, and here's the beginning of looking at cancellations, Field Post Office 1014. And the date is the 27th of April, 1956. And the Field Post Office 1014 was reported to the British Forces Post Office 150. And we'll come back to talking about these. Field post offices were with the unit, with the military unit, Army unit, Navy unit, whatever. It said this was the post office for Maralinga, but it's given that date, it was actually the Field Post Office 1014 was at the RAF, Royal Australian Air Force Pierce in Western Australia. Remember, that's quite near Perth on this date, in support of Operation Mosaic. So this was actually a Mosaic, Operation Mosaic cover going to the War Office in London. Now, up until about 1956, things have been very, very secret and very quiet. So it's very hard to find identifiable items to link to the early tests. But by 1956, the Field Post Office was established. The choice of Maralinga was officially announced in April 55, and an agreement with the Brits was signed, between the Australian and the Brits was signed in 1956. So by now, the public was well aware that these tests were taking place. And initially, they were quite supportive of the tests, about 70% in favor, 30% opposed. That soon changed over the 1950s, as I think many of you know. So a quick summary then. Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. The first test at Montebello Islands was pretty big, 25 kilotons. It dug a big hole in the ocean floor. The tests in Emu Field in desert in Australia were both small, deliberately so. They were testing different casings of the bomb. But going back to the Montebello Islands in 1956, the first test was reasonably small, but the second test on the tower was massive at 56 minimum, 56 kilotons. So that was the first group of 3 tests before we go to Maralinga. This covered 5 of the total atomic tests in Australia, and now the majority, the other 7, were carried out at Maralinga. So let's move on to Maralinga. And one of the problems of building Maralinga, and again, you had to build a huge construction site in the desert, and it started in mid-55, but really didn't get going until March 1956. And we're talking about a village that could accommodate 750 people, and at one point up to 1,600 personnel, military personnel, were handled in the village of Maralinga. It had labs, workshops, hospital, shops, church, power station, post office, bank, library, and movie theater, swimming pool, and playing areas for tennis, football, cricket, and golf. So it was a big undertaking to build this town in the desert in Maralinga. And this just is one little aspect of it. I thought I'd put it in for fun. For the cooperation of all members of Camp 43 is essential if the supplies of fresh water, all purposes, are to be maintained. Water is drawn from one saltwater bore only, and freshwater supplies are obtained by evaporation with 3 small evaporators with a very limited output. There is no other source of water available. To prevent a return to salt water in the bathrooms, members are requested to observe the following: minimum time under the showers, no running taps, and careful and considerate use of water at all times. This shows you some of the challenges of laying, 1,800 feet of cable in the desert and setting up. So there were 2 things to set up. There was the township to set up, and then there were the testing sites. The military did the testing sites, but the township was done by civil contractors. And they needed personnel, so they started advertising for personnel. So then everybody knew that the bombing was taking place in Australia. And at one stage, they were offering £40 a week. And I remember working as a fruit picker a little after June 56, when first year university, and I was getting the minimum wage, which was £6 a week. So £40 a week was a considerably high wage. But they got it built. They got it built, the whole village, and the site built with 2 days to spare. They got it all built in 6 months. So here's a letter, a forces letter to Hong Kong, British Post Office of Hong Kong. And you need to look on the back of the letter. So we've got Field Post Office 1014 again. We've seen that. And it's from a lieutenant colonel with the IF group. And the IF group was the indoctrinine force. And they brought all the people that were involved in the test together under one camp to educate them on what atomic bombs could do and how people had to be careful and all the rest of it. But you'll notice he's identified that he's involved with Buffalo, which was the next series of tests at Maralinga. And the inside, it says no bombs today, and it's the 24th of September. The first test in the Buffalo series took place on the 27th of September. So once again, looking at the cancellation, looking at the date, looking at the reverse, allows you to see that the BFPO, the British Forces Post Office 151, is now established at Maralinga. Also, to give you an idea, an overview of the Operation Buffalo involved 4 tests, one on a tower, one on the ground, in a pit on the ground, One was an airdrop, and the last one was also a tower. And they had various amounts of yields as well. So September, October, Australia's spring is the best weather conditions at this part of the world, and that's why the tests were carried out there. So here's a very early guy, comes out from the Royal Air Force in England, arrives in 28th of May 1956. Remember, the real building of the village only started in March, and by May they had quite a lot of the buildings up, but it's still a very early cover coming in. And he went to the Air Force base, was near Adelaide, called Edinburgh Air Force Base, and it was called Edinburgh Air Force Base because it was opened by the Duke of Edinburgh in the 1954 royal visit to Australia. So here we have two covers from the same guy, one with Australian stamps, one with British stamps. And you'll notice the one on the right now has Field Post Office 1046 here. And we know that who the guy is because on the back, the equipment section, ATG Buffalo, and ATG stands for Air Task Group. And while these people were involved with the RAF, everyone chipped in building. So while the Army may have had a major input into building the test sites, certainly anyone from Air Force or Navy that was assigned to these tests chipped in. So moving on, this is pre the first test, and then this is post the first test. The first test at Buffalo being on the 27th of September. This is the 15th of October from an RAF Wing Commander at Maralinga and the British Forces Post Office. Now, just taking a moment out, a field post office went with the unit, went with the unit that was the military personnel was assigned to. The British Forces Post Office was like the clearinghouse. So the British Forces Post Office may have a lot of field post officers reporting to them. In fact, the British Forces Post Office 151 in the end had 10 field post officers reporting through them. The British Field Post Office sold British stamps. And here again is 2 British stamps making up tuppence halfpenny, and we'll come back to that. That was the concession rate. Again, Field Post Office 1014, and we've seen that Field Post Office before. On the right is a cover using Australian stamps going back to England, and it has Post Office with the task group 308.5. Now, 308 was the Navy contingent. They had 308.1, 2, 3, and 4 were Navy, but 308.5 was Air Force, Royal Air Force. And so this is a hand stamp from the Air Force, mailed at Adelaide, which is just 25 kilometers away from the Edinburgh airfield. So these are both 29th of October, 15th of October. These are after the first test. Then we move on. Now, this is test number 3. This is the results of test number 3. They monitored the fallout, but if you look at test number 3, and remember test number 3 was the airdrop test. So this was the first, the British test from an aeroplane. And it exploded about 1,500 feet above the desert. And this is the distribution of radioactivity. Now, if you'll notice, it goes over the 3 biggest cities in Australia. And this was in October 56. And in November 56, the Olympic Games were held in Melbourne. I don't think anyone was thinking very much. Now, they argued that this wasn't terribly extensive radioactivity or serious radioactivity, but there clearly was, since the winds tend to go from west to east, there clearly was, the little dots here, by the way, represent all the monitoring stations. They clearly was radioactive effects on the country. So after the 4 tests for Buffalo came Project Antler. And Antler had 3 tests in 1957. And once again, you get these nice envelopes. Yes, the cachets are interesting, and that's probably the first reason why I bought them way back when. If I saw them, they just looked interesting, and so I bought them. And here's our old friend, Field Post Office 1014, and this one is Field Post Office 1046. But you flip them over, and on the back, you've got evidence of who these people were. And both of them refer to Air Task Group Antler, Air Task Group Antler. So you know these people were, this is a senior aircraft man, leading aircraft man, and the leading aircraft man. LAC is leading aircraft man, SAC, senior aircraft man. Senior aircraft man, leading aircraft man is one bit below a senior aircraft man, if anyone's interested. But here we have a couple of nice covers with commemorative stamps. So the British Forces Post Offices had commemorative stamps. And you might notice that this is going to the British Forces Post Office 151, and we now have BFPO 153. In general, British Forces Post Office 150 started at Perth. 151 was at the Edinburgh Airfield near Adelaide. 152 was signed to Darwin in Northern Australia, but never really was operational. And then 153 was assigned to Maralinga, and that's what we have here. So the 1014 now is going to a different British Forces Post Office because it's not near the airfield near Adelaide. It's now out in the field at Maralinga. Also, it's from an RAF balloon unit, and you might remember, well, let's have a quick look. So here's the program for Antler, 1957, September 57, and October 57. Tower, balloon. So they were going to let off an atomic bomb with 3 balloons holding it up. Now, it turned out this was very messy, and a lot of things went wrong. They had a huge storm, and that blew up, destroyed a couple of the balloons, and a bunch of them went missing, and then they had to find them. But subsequently, the Brits did pretty well with balloons in Christmas Island in the Pacific. So what I like is that, whoops, no, let me just go back. That this is from the Royal Air Force balloon unit of this guy who's at this cover. All right, and that's why we needed the balloon unit, because on October 57, the 3rd test in the Antler group used balloons. This is a nice cover in that it's a printed Maralinga cover, but it's got this Task Force Antler hand stamp, and that's quite hard to find. Again, Field Post Office 1014 in 1957. It's going to Northern Ireland from a squadron leader. Then we get into, having touched on all the major tests, we get into this Maralinga experimental program. They didn't want to call it Maralinga minor tests or the Maralinga test, because in 1957, of course, we had the 58, the moratorium on atmospheric testing from 58 to 63. So while the Brits continued to do tests right through this period, they didn't consider, in the atmosphere outside, these were not atomic bombs. These were components of the atomic bombs. And they did over 500 of these tests. And these tests involved all sorts of nasty pieces of material, in particular uranium, beryllium, polonium, and plutonium, all left out there in the desert. And the worst one of all of these, of course, is plutonium, because it has a half-life of 24,000 years, so it never disappears. And we'll get back to that. But this experimental program turned out to be the really big polluting program. So here we have a cover from Field Post Office 1046 on May the 19th, 1959. And that's the period where the Maralinga, they'd finished the 12 atomic bomb tests. Now it's the experimental program. And here, Post Office, Field Post Office 1014, also 1959. And this is from the Maralinga Range Support Unit. The Maralinga Range Support Unit had people from all 6 services involved: Army, Navy, Air Force, British, and Australian. And it was roughly 70% British, 30% Australian, and about 750 people involved. couple of other covers for you to have a look at. Again, our friendly field post office 1046, slightly different cachet. And this one's a bit different, field post office 1016 from a JSTU, and you have to dig in and find that's the Joint Services Trials Unit. And again, it's from this experimental program in Edinburgh Airfield, and the cachet on this is Edinburgh Airfield, South Australia. And a couple of different covers, one with Australian stamps, where you can see that it has this is a military armed forces concession postal hand stamp diamond. And this person was at Woomera. That turns out they were mailed not through a British Forces post office, but with Australian stamps. They went through the Australian postal system. And the one on the right is, of course, official, certified official. It went to the headquarters of Central Command in Middlesex in England, and it didn't need stamps. But it went from Field Post Office 80 in 1965. So let's just touch, we've sort of touched on the philately aspects, but let's just move on and look at a couple of postal matters. Now, the British Forces concession postal rates, basically you got airmail service from Australia to England at the surface mail rate in England. And that surface mail rate was tuppence halfpenny on letters not exceeding 1 ounce, increased to threepence in October 57 and to fourpence in May 65. So while this is going to a stamp shop in Waterloo, London, it is a nice little cover showing the Field Post Office 1014 in 1958. And you look up here at 1958, the rate was threepence. And so you've got 1 penny, 1.5 penny, and half penny, which gives you a total of threepence. So it's correctly postage, even though it's a philatelic cover. The Australian concession forces concession postal rates, they had postal rates for British personnel serving in Australia, 2 for surface mail, but almost everyone sent everything by airmail, and it was threepence for airmail for letters up to 1 ounce addressed to England. But the Australian Inland Forces concession rate, so if you were mailing within Australia, there were 1 penny for surface mail and fourpence for airmail. And this is an army cover in Adelaide associated with the Weapons Research Establishment, mailed to a betting company. Tattersalls is a well-known betting company, but it's going from Adelaide to Victoria, Melbourne, Victoria. So it's within Australia, and it went for 1 penny, given that they were entitled to the forces concession rate. Department of the Army concession postal rate. So that's why we see a lot of threepence is the postal rate for active service going to England, to Kent, England. And this is the UK liaison staff in Australia, which kept the government's liaised through that staff initially in Melbourne and subsequently in Canberra. They had a hand stamp which had on active service airmail concession rate not built into the hand stamp. It was a separate hand stamp. And then subsequently, they had a hand stamp where it was built in. So this is a very early cover, 1952, when the rate to England, the concession rate was threepence. This one was a little more difficult to work out. It's got 1 and 8 pence postage on it. That's 20 pence. And it turns out it's threepence for the first ounce, 7 pence for the second half ounce, 7 pence for the third half ounce, and threepence for registration. And there's the registration label. And as I've suggested, the field post offices stayed with their units. The British Forces post offices imported the stamps and sent them out to the field post offices. And these are all British stamps. So this is 1046 again. We've seen that one. We haven't seen this one before. This is Field Post Office 1003. But now we're getting a 1962. We're getting out of the range of the big tests. And here's a couple more. This is 1010, Field Post Office 1010 on a nice cachet again. And this is Field Post Office 1033. Same cachet, different color. But note, this airmail label that's printed on the envelope is the British airmail label. And this airmail label printed on the envelope is the Australian airmail label. These envelopes were available at the shops so people could buy them and use them at any time. And by now, by February 67, the rate had increased to 4 pence. So there were advertising slogans. Royal Air Force on Air Force apprenticeship training provides fine training. Royal Air Force apprenticeship scheme provides fine training. And this is a nice one. Save while you serve for a home you can own. And if you keep your eyes out, these aren't very common, but you can find nice. We know this one was used in 1959 on the 20th of February. So we know this is a 1959 cover. From Field Post Office 1014. And here we have the British Field Post Office 153, which, as I pointed out, is the Maralinga Field Post Forces Post Office. Finally, Maralinga had its own post office for a very short period from 1956 to 1959. It was believed to be opened in late July 1956. So this is a registered letter envelope, and there were no special concession rates for registered letters. It's going from Maralinga to Adelaide, so hardly anywhere at all. But it's a temporary registration label with a relief postmark, suggesting there's a very early cover that the circular date stamp hasn't yet arrived at Maralinga, but it's verified by the hand stamp on the registration label. And this is a very late cover, November 1959, 21st of November 1959, and it's believed that the post office closed right around there, if not early December. So this is an early and late cover. The one on the bottom here, because it's going from Maralinga to Adelaide, it's within Australia. So 2 halfpenny stamps pay the 1 penny inland surface concession rate in Australia. Finally, we're getting to the end of the details, but not the end of the presentation. Here's a cover, again going to Tattersalls, showing the Army concession penny rate with a nice Maralinga date stamp of the 21st of August 1957. A commercial use of the Maralinga South Australia date stamp. All right, let's get down to the end here. Here we have a parcel tag from London to Maralinga. And so this would have been attached to airbags, airport. And here we have a form called an AV7 form from 1965. You can see it up here with Field Post Office 80 from BFPO 151 going to London. Another bag from BFPO 151 going to Birmingham. A bag from BFPO 159 going to London. And the first flight was on Trans-Australia Airlines 527 from Adelaide to Sydney. And the second flight would have been on Qantas Flight 755 to London and onward to Birmingham. So this is going into Maralinga, this is leaving Maralinga, and I love being able to include things like this in presentations. Ancillary material is always a lot of fun. So the cleanup started in 1967, and the cleanup started in 1963. And then Operation Hercules had a cleanup in 1964. And what did they do? They'd send out bulldozers and bulldozed the topsoil into some of the bunkers and covered them up. And all they did is spread the contamination all around. And of course, the people on the bulldozers got contaminated themselves. And then they had a bit more of a sensible cleanup, Operation Brumby in 1967, where they actually put stuff in ditches and put cement slabs over the top. But once again, you're just bulldozing radioactive material all around. And finally, in 1979, the Brits realized that the plutonium was really quite serious, and they came in and cleaned up the plutonium, or at least so they left the Australians with the impression they cleaned up the plutonium. But by now, Australians were getting pretty annoyed. People were beginning to get cancer. Servicemen who'd served there beginning to get cancer. Aboriginal people who had been in the area were beginning to get cancer. And they had a McClelland Royal Commission in 1985, and which concluded there were still significant radiation hazards. And so a cleanup started in 1996 that went 4 years to 2000, cost $108 million. And the British were requested to make a contribution. So the British made a contribution of £20 million towards the cleanup. But even that didn't solve the problem. The Australian government ended up compensating the Aborigines with no full compensation in 1994 with $13.5 million. And most of the land was returned to the Aborigines in 2009 to the traditional owners. And finally, all the land was returned to them in 2014. And this is what we end up with. And the only evidence out in the Nullarbor, out in the desert, that there were any tests besides the contamination is this little plaque, this little concrete plaque in the bottom right-hand corner. While that is the end, of course, these tests led to further tests in Christmas Island, in the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. And so this cover here said Christmas Island, geophysical tests, Great Britain site for atomic pests. But it's the wrong Christmas Island. This is Indian Ocean. And Guthrie, who was a stamp dealer in Australia, should have known better. The subsequent tests occurred in the Gilbert and Ellice Islands at Christmas Island. And you can get some lovely covers here. And here's one with British stamps, and here's one with Gilbert and Ellice Island stamps, now Kiribati. But this is not Australia, so it's beyond our presentation today. And so I thank you for your attention. All done. I will stop share.
Thank you very much, David. That was tremendous. I find that the cachets for the airmail letters, there was a couple with the indigenous people on the cover, and also with the explosion in the background. And it wasn't as if they were trying to cover it up in any way, was it?
Well, they did try and cover it up in the early 50s, but by the mid 50s on, it was quite clear that to everyone, to the public, that this was taking place. And public opinion gradually turned as we ended up going towards the nuclear moratorium on testing and the partial test ban treaty in 1963. So no, I mean, these are a bunch of guys out in the desert. They knew there were Aborigines around, and they sold envelopes to them so they could mail their letters home to their families in England. So no, there was no attempt to cover it up, and nobody was really beginning to raise the questions that subsequently got raised in the 70s and 80s about as cancer started to appear in servicemen and the Aboriginal population. And the Aboriginal population in Australia, and they're now beginning to call themselves First Nations populations in Australia, had never had cancer before, apparently. I've read that a number of places, and all of a sudden they started getting cancer in the 80s.
Jean asked, were any of these outgoing covers censored?
No, none were censored. That's a good question, Jean. I don't know why. I mean, certainly, I think they didn't want attention drawn to them in the early stages in 52 through 55, when they were trying to keep everything very secret. But subsequently, it was well known that these post offices were established on Australian soil. And so it wasn't like they were trying to make sure that servicemen didn't talk about their experiences.
And were the advertising slogans on Forces Mail applied by hand, or on all the outgoing covers?
Oh, no, only very selective outgoing covers. There are very, very few of these around. They're hand stamps, as I pointed out. They are hand stamps, and they were just applied by hand, either on the front or the back. It can be either on the front or the back of the cover. They're quite hard to find. There's a couple of beauties out there. One involving driving tanks, trying to get young men to enlist because they could drive a tank. But the two I found the most interesting are the two I showed.
Thomas also asked that in 1957, Operation Antler commemorative stamp covers sent to the UK. Why was one posted at 2.5 pence and the other at 4 pence, double weight?
Good question. In fact, the extra weight I think would have been 7 pence. I think it was overpaid, and I think notice they were commemorative stamps. They were Scout commemorative stamps. So I think the sender just chose to overpay to use a commemorative stamp. I could come up with an explanation of why a fourpence cover fourpenny cover was used, because in fact the Australian rate, if you used Australian stamps, and it was at that period, would have cost fourpence to send. If you'd used Australian stamps, you would have had to put fourpence in Australian stamps on the envelope to send it airmail to England. And so there may have been a slight confusion between the British rate and the Australian rate.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, David, for your presentation, and your knowledge and research into this subject was outstanding. Before we close tonight, we'd like to acknowledge the lands that we're on, and we'd like to thank again Longley Auctions. Please visit longleyauctions.com, and maybe you can find some postal history treasures for your collection or possibly your next exhibit. Thank you for joining us. And next time, please join us for Stamp Panels, where you will be the presenter with an opportunity to share your favorite philatelic item, new acquisition, or treasure. And we look forward to that. So get your collection out and get ready to share. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a great evening.
Bye.